That was Michael Anthony, okay? 100% dedicated, never did anything to hurt those guys, and they tried to hurt him again and again and again. For Eddie to say he had to show him what to play and had to teach him all those songs, that is the biggest line of bullshit I've ever heard in my life. I was in that band for 11 years. There was never a video camera involved of Eddie showing him what to play.
For years, Michael Anthony stayed silent and loyal to the legacy, even as his own role in Van Halen was pushed aside. But after Eddie Van Halen's death, that silence finally broke. Now, Anthony is opening up about the tension, the pain, and the conversation they never got to finish. What really happened between the longtime bandmates, and why did their friendship fall apart when the world thought it was unbreakable? Join us as we uncover the truth Michael Anthony revealed about Eddie Van Halen. Anthony's biggest regret. In a recent interview with Get on the Bus, Michael Anthony spoke candidly about the one thing he wishes had ended differently in his career: his time with Van Halen. He described the band's peak as a dream. They were unstoppable. Even after David Lee Roth left, bringing in Sammy Hagar gave them a fresh start and kept the momentum alive. But despite all the success, the ending never sat right with him. "It should have ended with a bang, something that shook the world," Anthony said, but instead it just faded out. That regret runs deeper because of the unresolved tension between him and Eddie Van Halen. The two hadn't spoken in years. It wasn't until Wolfgang, Eddie's son, reached out that a reunion was even considered. Eddie was reportedly ready to move on and bring everyone back together. But in the end, the plans fell apart. For Anthony, calling this his biggest regret says a lot, especially for someone who lived through the rise, fall, and chaos of one of rock's most iconic bands. To really understand its weight, you have to go back to the beginning and see how the Van Halen story changed over time. Early musical foundation. Michael Anthony was never the loudest name in Van Halen, but his bass lines were the glue that held everything together. He was the steady hand behind the chaos, and long before the stadiums and roaring crowds, one quiet moment set it all in motion. Music had always been part of his life. His father, Walter Sobolewski, played trumpet, and the sound of brass regularly filled their home. Hearing his dad rehearse left a lasting impression on young Michael and sparked his love for music. Following in his father's footsteps, Michael picked up the trumpet and joined school music programs and marching bands. These early experiences taught him discipline, rhythm, and teamwork, skills that would carry into his career. After his family moved to Southern California in the mid-1960s, he enrolled at Dana Junior High in Arcadia, where his interest in performing only grew. By 13, Michael was pulled in a new direction: rock. While most kids reached for guitars or drums, he wanted to stand out. A friend, Mike Hershey, lent him a Fender Mustang guitar. Michael stripped off 2 strings and turned them into a bass. That decision changed everything. Seeing his commitment, Michael's father bought him a real bass and an amp. From there, he poured himself into practice, driven by idols like Jack Bruce, John Paul Jones, and Harvey Brooks. Though he was naturally left-handed, he learned to play right-handed, a small detail that showed his focus and drive. These early influences, his father, school music, and relentless practice, laid the groundwork. And just as his skill hit its stride, fate connected him to a band that would change rock history. From Snake to Van Halen. In the early 1970s, Michael Anthony was immersed in the Southern California music scene. He cycled through several local bands before landing in one that stood out, a power trio called Snake. The group blended hard rock with blues, with Anthony on bass and lead vocals. They mostly played covers, but their original songs gave him space to build confidence and sharpen his presence on stage. Snake quickly became a regular at school dances, local festivals, and clubs around Arcadia and Pasadena. These shows weren't just gigs, they were real steps toward something bigger. It was during this period that Anthony realized he wasn't chasing a hobby anymore. He was pursuing a career. The San Gabriel Valley music circuit was tight, and that's where Snake crossed paths with a rising local band called Mammoth, led by brothers Eddie and Alex Van Halen. Both groups often played the same venues. At one Pasadena high school show, Mammoth's PA system failed. Without hesitation, Anthony offered up Snake's gear to keep the show running. That small act left a big impression on the Van Halen brothers. Soon after, Mammoth's bassist, Mark Stone, left the band. Eddie and Alex remembered Anthony's skill, energy, and generosity, and invited him to a jam session. It took place in a garage, but the sound they created there was anything but small. His tight bass work and vocal strength clicked instantly with their style. The chemistry was undeniable. They brought him in as a full member right away. Not long after, the band dropped the name Mammoth and rebranded it as Van Halen, both to avoid a naming conflict and to spotlight the brothers at their core. With David Lee Roth on vocals, Eddie on guitar, Alex on drums, and Michael on bass, the classic lineup was born. For Anthony, joining Van Halen didn't just mark the next step in his career, it launched him into rock history. Band dynamics. By the mid-1970s, Van Halen had locked in its classic lineup, and Michael Anthony had become a core part of the band's identity. As they lit up the Los Angeles club scene, playing spots like Gazzari's and the Whiskey A Go-Go, Anthony stood out. His stage presence was electric, and his high harmonies added a sharp edge to the band's vocals. The contrast between his voice and David Lee Roth's lead created a signature sound that set Van Halen apart from the pack. His bass playing was just as important. While Eddie tore through solos and Alex pounded the drums, Anthony held the groove steady. His style wasn't flashy, but it was tight and reliable, the kind of rhythm that gave the band its foundation. When Van Halen dropped their debut album in 1978, Anthony's impact was unmistakable. His bass lines powered songs like Runnin' with the Devil and Ain't Talkin' 'Bout Love, while his harmonies elevated tracks like Jamie's Cryin' and Feel Your Love Tonight. The record launched the band into the spotlight, and Anthony's work played a major role in that breakthrough. In those early days, he was treated as an equal. He earned a fair cut from record sales, tours, and merch. According to former manager Noel Monk, Anthony also shared in the band's debts and helped shape key business decisions. But as the band grew, the balance began to shift. Power and profits gradually consolidated around Eddie, Alex, and Roth. Anthony's financial share was quietly reduced, and his influence behind the scenes started to fade. Still, he stayed locked on the music. Through every tour and recording session, Anthony showed up and delivered. No drama, no excuses. By the time albums like Fair Warning and Diver Down came out, his role as the band's rhythmic anchor was undeniable. His vocals remained a vital layer of the band's sound, and his bass work kept their chaos under control. While Eddie amazed crowds and Roth grabbed headlines, Anthony was the steady hand in the background, the one keeping it all together. Over time, fans and critics alike came to see just how essential he was to Van Halen's sound and strength. The 1984 contract controversy. By 1984, Van Halen was at its peak. Their self-titled album, 1984, produced huge hits like Jump, Panama, and Hot for Teacher, and the band had become a global phenomenon. But behind the scenes, things were falling apart. Michael Anthony, a founding member and key part of the band's sound, was being quietly pushed aside. According to former manager Noel Monk, the shift became clear during the 1984 tour when Anthony's role and his rights were suddenly stripped away. In his book, Runnin' with the Devil, Monk wrote that Anthony was pressured into signing away all future royalties and songwriting credits. The deal was handed to him backstage before a show, with Eddie, Alex, and David Lee Roth standing over him. Despite contributing to the album as both a bassist and backing vocalist, he signed. The contract was retroactive, so he also lost credit for the 1984 album itself. That moment changed everything. Anthony went from being an equal partner to a hired hand. Monk later said he would have stopped the deal if he'd known, but by then it was done. Wanting to keep the peace and avoid derailing the tour, Anthony gave in. The consequences were massive. By giving up his share, Anthony lost out on millions in royalties from reissues, licensing, and greatest hits collections. 1984 alone sold over 10 million copies in the U.S., but he saw little of that success financially. Though he continued touring and recording with Van Halen for years, Anthony's influence was gone. He had no say in business or creative decisions and was left vulnerable to later changes in the lineup. Still, he stayed silent. For years, Anthony never publicly criticized the band. He kept showing up, playing his part, and honoring the music. Much later, in interviews and fan Q&As, he confirmed the story. He admitted he signed under pressure, but said his main reason was simple. He didn't want the band to fall apart. He chose unity over control. That decision came at a cost, both financially and personally. But it also showed the kind of person Anthony was: loyal, steady, and committed to the music. The 1984 contract saga remains one of the clearest examples of how power can shift inside a band, even when everyone helped build its legacy. Eddie's criticism. After Van Halen's peak, things started to shift for Michael Anthony, not in his playing, but in how he was treated. Though he had been part of the band's core sound from the beginning, his role was increasingly minimized, especially by Eddie Van Halen. The most striking moment came in 2015, when Eddie told Billboard that Anthony lacked basic bass skills, even claiming he had to show him how to play every note. The backlash was immediate. Fans and fellow musicians pushed back, saying the remarks didn't match Anthony's decades of solid, professional performances. Eddie's claims didn't reflect the Michael Anthony most people knew. He was known for tight bass lines and clear, high harmonies that helped define Van Halen's sound. In later interviews, Anthony denied needing help with parts, stating he always learned the material himself, and that there were no sessions where Eddie had to teach him what to play. He made a simple point. If those claims were true, there would be proof. But there wasn't. And that absence spoke volumes. Still, what hurt most wasn't the public criticism. It was that it came from someone he once considered a close friend. Anthony had stayed loyal to the band through chaos and change, so hearing himself dismissed like that was deeply personal. The remarks briefly clouded his reputation, and some newer fans questioned his ability until they looked closer and found years of consistent playing and respect from within the music world. Anthony didn't fire back publicly. He stayed respectful, but admitted the divide between him and Eddie only grew wider. By the mid-2000s, their relationship had nearly disappeared. And behind the scenes, Anthony was being pushed further out of the band he helped create. The decline of Anthony's role. By the late 1990s, Michael Anthony's place in Van Halen was starting to slip. On Van Halen 3, he played bass on just 3 of the 11 tracks. Eddie Van Halen handled the rest, an early sign that the band's dynamic was shifting. Anthony still appeared in promos and toured after the album dropped, but fans noticed his studio role had been reduced. The steady presence he once had in shaping the band's sound was fading. In the early 2000s, his influence continued to shrink. Though he took part in some reunion talks and joined a few rehearsals, he wasn't involved in recording. When the band released The Best of Both Worlds in 2004, Anthony didn't play on any of the new tracks. His only role was background vocals. The message was clear. He was being pushed aside. Control of the band had narrowed to Eddie and Alex, and Anthony's input was no longer welcome. Even the 2004 reunion tour with Sammy Hagar, his last with Van Halen, came at a cost. According to Hagar, Anthony had to accept reduced pay and was treated more like a session player than a founding member. The tour was a hit, but it didn't mend the deeper damage. Anthony later said he tried to stay professional, but it became obvious the band no longer saw him as part of its future. Behind the scenes, the replacement was already set. In 2006, Eddie chose his teenage son, Wolfgang, to take over on bass. But Anthony didn't hear it from the band. Like many fans, he found out through rumors and online chatter. Years later, he spoke about how much the silence hurt. Being replaced was one thing, but after decades of work and loyalty, there was no call, no meeting, no goodbye. His exit wasn't announced. It just happened. Quietly. Without respect. What once felt like a brotherhood ended not with a decision, but with distance. And for Anthony, that spoke louder than anything else. Sammy Hagar collaborations. After Van Halen, Michael Anthony didn't slow down. Instead, he found new energy alongside a familiar face, Sammy Hagar. Reuniting with the former Van Halen frontman, Anthony quickly tapped back into the chemistry that had helped define the band's peak years. Their first major project was The Other Half, launched in 2006. Focused on performing Van Halen classics from both the Roth and Hagar eras, the group gave fans a powerful taste of the old sound. The name, The Other Half, was a subtle nod to the idea that while they weren't the Van Halen brothers, they had been just as essential to the band's identity. Their shows became an unofficial continuation of the spirit they once helped build. Before that, Anthony and Hagar had joined a short-lived supergroup in 2002 called Planet Us. Alongside Joe Satriani, Dean Castronovo, and briefly Neil Schon, the band recorded a few standout tracks, including Psycho Vertigo and Peephole. Though they never released a full album, some of their work ended up on Hagar's 2008 solo project, Cosmic Universal Fashion. It was a brief run, but a reminder that Anthony could still hold his own among elite musicians. Then in 2008 came Chickenfoot, the most successful of Anthony's post-Van Halen projects. With Hagar, Satriani, and Red Hot Chili Peppers drummer Chad Smith, the group released their debut album in 2009 to strong reviews and a Billboard Top 10 debut. Anthony's signature bass lines and tight harmony vocals helped carve out a fresh identity for the band. Chickenfoot 3 followed in 2011, proving the group had staying power. This wasn't a side project, it was the real deal. Critics and fans saw it as proof that Anthony wasn't living in the past, he was still evolving. In 2014, Anthony teamed up with Hagar again for Sammy Hagar and the Circle, featuring Vic Johnson on guitar and Jason Bonham on drums. Their live shows were a blend of Van Halen, Zeppelin, Montrose, and Hagar's solo work, bringing both nostalgia and new energy to the stage. In 2019, the band released their first studio album, Space Between, which climbed to number 4 on the Billboard 200. It was a clear signal. They weren't just relying on old hits, they were still creating music that connected. Across all these projects, one thing stayed constant: Anthony's love for music. He never stopped creating, never stopped growing. his story didn't end with Van Halen. In many ways, it just kept getting louder. Cancelled reunion tour. After Eddie Van Halen passed in 2020, fans immediately began hoping for a tribute concert or tour, something fitting to honor his legacy. Behind the scenes, quiet talks of a reunion started taking shape. By 2021 and 2022, the idea gained traction. Alex Van Halen reached out to former bandmates, including Michael Anthony and David Lee Roth, to explore putting something together. Guitarist Joe Satriani was also contacted as a possible stand-in for Eddie during the shows. Satriani later confirmed that the plan was serious, a special concert series meant to celebrate the band's history. Everyone agreed that Anthony's presence was essential, not just musically, but also to give the reunion real weight and emotional closure. But as progress was being made, problems surfaced. Roth reportedly disagreed with how the tribute should be framed. According to people close to the talks, he was hesitant to make it solely about Eddie, and his unwillingness to compromise stalled the project. At the same time, Alex Van Halen was dealing with health issues of his own. A serious back injury in 2022 made it unlikely he could take on the demands of touring. With Roth and Alex both stepping back, the foundation of the reunion collapsed. Anthony later confirmed he was approached and open to joining. But despite his interest, the emotional baggage, timing, and internal disagreements made it impossible to move forward. He had hoped the project would offer closure, not just for himself, but for the fans. While he had reconnected with Wolfgang Van Halen, the deeper divides with Roth and Alex remained. In the end, the tribute never happened. The long-awaited final chapter, one last show with all the key members, faded before it could begin. Instead of ending with a powerful farewell, Van Halen's legacy was left without a true send-off, just a quiet, unfinished goodbye to one of rock's most iconic stories. What do you think about Michael finally breaking his silence? Did Eddie Van Halen owe him more, or were the wounds just too deep to ever fully heal? And after hearing the full story, does it change the way you view Van Halen's legacy? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.